Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with Part 8, the Migrations of Buddhism, from the Adepts in the Eastern Esoteric Tradition, by Manly Palmer Hall, Part 2, the Arhats of Buddhism. The Migrations of Buddhism. Although it is generally assumed that the decline of Buddhism in India was due to religious persecution, other factors were involved. By the 8th century AD, the numerous Buddhist sects had developed esoteric systems which mingled with the Hindu revival of mysticism. It was often impossible to distinguish clearly between the mantric and tantric practices which had gained popularity among the Hindus and the Buddhists. Prior to the Mohammedan conquest, however, the Arhats of the Middle Path carried the doctrine to many remote parts of Asia. The wonderful powers attributed to these Buddhist saints indicate that the Yogacarya system had already colored the original teachings with extravagant metaphysical speculations. About the middle of the 1st century AD, the Chinese emperor Ming had a wonderful dream in which he saw a man of gigantic stature with a nimbus about his head. When the emperor described the golden giant to the officers of his court, one of the ministers explained that in the western quarter of the world there was a god so represented whose name was Buddha. Ming then sent envoys to India to make inquiries respecting the Buddhist doctrine. E.A. Gordon describes what followed thus. It was in response to these imperial inquiries that two religious accompanied Cai Yin, the Chinese envoy, back from Kanishka's court in the kingdom of Fo, as Gandhara was styled by the later Mongols, by the trade route across the Khyber Pass, taking a sandalwood image of Buddha and 5 sacred books, which, as they approached the capital, the envoy caused to be borne upon a white horse into Loyang, Japanese Rakuyo, where the emperor reverently received and had a pagoda built for them, attached to a monastery in which he ordered the monks should be housed. The Buddhist monks Kasyapa Matanga and Dharmaraksha, who came to China at the command of the Han Emperor, both died within 3 years and left only translations of some sections of the sutras. These sections were limited to the ethical importance of Buddhism and revealed very little of the deeper philosophy. Occasionally thereafter, missionaries from India reached China and were provided with monastic houses. It was not, however, until the beginning of the 4th century that native Chinese were permitted to become Buddhist monks. From the 4th to the 10th century may be regarded as the golden age of Buddhism in China. The Sung dynasty, 908 to 1280, favored the revival of Confucian philosophy. By this time, however, both Buddhism and Taoism had reached influential proportions, and many of their concepts were incorporated into the restoration of Confucianism. It has been noted that the Chinese intellectuals favored the teachings of Confucius, and as a result, the Buddhist scholars were not able to reach this level of Chinese society. No sooner had Buddhism been established in the Chinese area than its influence was extended to regions previously inaccessible. The doctrine was introduced into Tibet through the marriage of the Tibetan king or chieftain Srongsan Gampo with the Buddhist daughter of the Chinese emperor. The faith then advanced toward Korea, which it reached AD 372. Here Buddhism flourished, especially from the 10th to the 14th centuries. It should be noted that in both China and Korea there has been a remarkable expansion of Buddhism since the beginning of the 20th century. Japan received the doctrine from Korea through the devotion and piety of the Prince Imperial, Shotoku Taishi. Within the last 100 years, Japan in turn has been noted for its missionary zeal. The Japanese Buddhist sects have established temples in Formosa, Korea, Manchuria, and China, and have gone so far as to extend their ministrations to the Hawaiian Islands, the United States, and Canada. Essentially, the purpose has been to serve the Japanese populations in these areas, but many non-Buddhists have been attracted. Chinese Buddhism developed several important sects, and these in turn were transferred to Japan and Korea. With the exception of Tibetan Lamaism, the various Buddhist denominations in China and Japan did not evolve any elaborate ecclesiasticism. It is usual, therefore, to compare them with the Protestant sects of Christianity. They differed in matters of emphasis, but were united in the essential truths of the original revelation. The one dissonant note is the Zen sect, which is intensely individualistic in matters of interpretation. There has been a great deal of expansion in Buddhism since the rise of what are called the modern sects. Actually, these groups came into existence in the 12th and 13th centuries and still claim a constantly increasing membership. McGovern is of the opinion that the Zen school has probably the most educated laity, and the Shin the most educated clergy at the present time. The broader expansion of Buddhism was due to the patronage of important rulers and the zeal of the Buddhist monks and scholars. There are many elements of Christian and Buddhist religious chemistry which have never been adequately analyzed. In the 4th century, Syriac bishops had seats along the Central Asian caravan routes. In AD 411, the Patriarch of Seleucia consecrated a metropolitan for China. This means that there were at least 6 bishops under him, and others were added later. Pilgrimage contributed to the spread of cultural traditions. Even at an early date, Chinese, Korean, and Mongolian converts were impelled to visit India and pay homage to the sacred places of Buddhism. Thus, Kashmir, Afghanistan, and other far places were visited and to a measure explored. To reach their ultimate destinations, these travelers had to pass through communities which had not received the benefits of the revelation. The travelers became missionaries, and the marvels and wonders which they reported were long remembered. At least one of the illustrious converts to the Mahayana school, the sage Kumarajiva, is known to have had contact with early Christianity. Gradually, a process of travel and conversion wove the Buddhism of Eastern Asia into one vast fabric. Nestorian Christian teachers were in the court of China during the 8th century, and the then flourishing religions of the world mingled their traditions, contributing to each other many colorful legends, symbols, and rituals. In time, the admixture became so complicated that it is no longer possible to distinguish the source of ideas in substance identical. Buddhism included no doctrinal requirement to advance its cause by conquest or the sword. The old monks mingled peacefully with their neighbors and made no effort to establish strong sectarian groups. Buddhism therefore became a quality in the ethical and moral life of Asia. It enriched without demanding recognition, and it served without hope of honor or reward. For most of the peoples which it reached, Buddhism was a better way of explaining, interpreting, and understanding beliefs and teachings already familiar. This thought underlies the legends which describe how the Buddhist Arhats actually converted the gods and demons of the communities where they established their schools. Nestorius, the Syrian Patriarch of Constantinople from 428 to 431, was involved in doctrinal difficulties with Cyril, the sanctified bishop of Alexandria. The real cause of the contention was apparently the increasing influence of the See of Constantinople. A synod was called, over which Cyril presided. This assembly pronounced Nestorius and his doctrine to be anathema, without permitting the accused prelate and his followers a hearing of any kind. Later, the entire session was declared by the emperor to be invalid. Ultimately, however, the Nestorians, being a minority group, were unable to maintain themselves and lost most of their holdings. The majority of Eastern Christians of early times belonged to the Nestorian churches, and there were communities of this sect in many parts of the Near East, India, and China. In 1274, Sir Marco Polo reported 2 Nestorian churches in Tartary. The modern sectaries venerate Nestorius as a saint, but reject the doctrine that the Blessed Virgin Mary was the Mother of God. In many respects, the Nestorians shared the moral and ethical convictions of the Buddhists, the simplicity, humility, and gentleness of the Buddhist monks, the monastic system which they had established, and the code of conduct which they practiced, brought the two sects close together in their practical purposes. Both were also minority groups at that time, struggling for survival against opposing beliefs unacceptable to both. Later, the Buddhists and the Nestorians suffered from the rise of Moslemism. It does not seem strange, therefore, that a certain exchange of ideas can be traced in the surviving forms of both groups. Traditionally, the spread of Buddhism was attributed to the zeal of missionary Arhats and Lohans. When it was reported to the Buddhist communities in India that some distant ruler or remote province desired to receive the doctrine, appropriate teachers were sent out, usually accompanied by pack animals loaded with books, images, and sacred relics. The oldest printed book in the world, discovered by Sir Auriel Stein and now in the British Museum, was published from woodblocks in the 9th century and is the Diamond Sutra of Buddha. In many instances, the Buddhist missionaries penetrated into illiterate areas where it was necessary to establish schools and to provide educational facilities. In this way, the Buddhist teachers were responsible for the rise of national cultures. The Arhats from Nalanda were distinguished for their scholarly attainments and combined religious, philosophical, and scientific instructions in their program for bestowing enlightenment. Although some of these teachers suffered persecution and martyrdom, they were, for the most part, received with kindness and consideration. Even cannibal tribes welcomed them and were inspired to reform savage practices. The success of these Buddhist missions was due largely to the pattern universally followed. The monks were quiet, unassuming, humble, and patient. They made no effort to become politically dominant. They were available when their counsel was required or solicited, but were content to be known through their works and the sincerity of their motives. Their contributions were so obviously beneficial that after a time they were accepted without reservation. The simple stories of the Arhats were soon elaborated by the grateful peoples who embraced the teaching. In those days, it appeared miraculous that lonely saints and sages could cross deserts, rivers, and mountains and come safely to the journey's end. Tribes given to nature worship believed the roads and paths to be infested by demons, evil spirits, and wicked ghosts. Yet the Buddhist monks passed through these perilous ways unmolested and undisturbed. Surely their powers must be great, and they must be masters of magic. As the stories grew, it was reported that one Arhat walked across a turbulent river, another flew through the wild passes of the Himalayas, and still another floated across an ocean on a palm leaf. In the northern system of Buddhism, the more celebrated Arhats were regarded as embodiments of, or extensions from, the bodhisattvas of the superior regions. Gradually, sanctified disciples mingled with the personifications of the attributes of universal consciousness until it is difficult to distinguish the historical saints from the persons of the mystical pantheon. Many of the immediate disciples of Gautama Buddha were elevated to arhatship, either during the lifetime of the teacher or soon after. The two great pupils who predeceased their master, Sariputta and Moggallana, were regarded as the right and left hands of the doctrine. Next in authority and veneration were the three who presided over the first council, Kasyapa, Upali, and Buddha's cousin and beloved disciple Ananda. These are recognized by both the northern and southern schools as most venerable Arhats. Later, certain founders and reformers were also considered as most deserving. In this group should be included Nagarjuna, Dharmapala, Vasumitra, Asvaghosha, Gunamati, Sriyamati, and Buddha's son, Rahula, who became the patron of novices and founder of the realistic school. Major General Furlong points out that there is a distinct tendency to exchange sanctified personalities and press them into the service of other religions. In his Faiths of Man, this learned writer gives a curious example. A 7th century religious romance, Balaam and Joasaph, resulted in the canonization of Buddha under the name Saint Josaphat. Josaphat is a corruption of Bodhisat. In the Greek and Latin martyrologies, his day is November 27th. Colonel Yule, in his Marco Polo, states that a church in Palermo is dedicated to this saint. Asvaghosha was the 11th patriarch of Buddhism and flourished in the 2nd century AD. He was born of a Brahmin family, but having been converted to Buddhism, he devoted his life to its service. He was a poet and a musician and is mentioned as an early Indian dramatist. He was summoned from Magadha to the court of King Kanishka, and while there probably wrote the life of Buddha. It is possible that the story of Buddha's life and ministry, which was carried to China by the monks summoned to the court of Ming-ti, was either a digest of Asvaghosha's account or parts thereof. The prestige of the learned northern patriarch was responsible for the circulation of what is now considered the standard biographical work on the life and ministry of Buddha. The story, as Asvaghosha told it, had a broad and urgent appeal and served to spread Buddhist doctrines through northeastern Asia. After the books brought by the first monks, a stream of sacred literature flowed into China from India. Liberal and enlightened sovereigns caused these works to be duly translated or transliterated, and the copies were placed in important monasteries. By the year AD 684, an extensive catalogue of these collections had been compiled. This assumed the proportions of a connective cord which bound them all together, and the accumulation emerged as a distinct corpus. Several waves of persecution, however, affected the descent of Chinese Buddhism. There was a brief crisis at the beginning of the Tang dynasty, inspired apparently by economic factors. The monks and nuns did not marry or establish families and refrained from economic enterprise, thereby reducing the revenue of the state. About AD 714, 12,000 Buddhist monks and priests were required to return to secular life, and the growth of the faith was strictly prohibited. A few years later, all this was changed, and Buddhism was in favor until the edict of the Emperor Wuzong in AD 845. At that time, nearly 5,000 monasteries were destroyed and some 40,000 religious houses and shrines were demolished. The properties of the sect were confiscated, and their bells and images melted down and made into currency. 260,000 monks and nuns were forced to give up their religious obligations. Almost immediately, however, Wuzong's successor reversed the policy, but naturally did not entirely restore the damage which had been done. The effort of the fourth emperor of the Manchu dynasty to suppress Buddhism resulted in the so-called Sacred Edict of 1662, which intimated that Buddhism was gaining too much wealth and influence. Although this edict was broadly circulated, it produced very little effect, and if anything, strengthened the resolutions of the devout and restored the courage of their spiritual convictions. Since that time, there has been general tolerance, and those opposed to Buddhism have been forced to advance their own beliefs by reasonable and moderate methods. A religion seldom expands in a foreign country unless it appeals to the inner conviction of converts. China was in need of a spiritual revelation which placed a strong emphasis upon the principle of faith. As in India, the need for a simple doctrine inspiring the average layman to a constructive code of conduct could not fail to win adherents. While Buddhism did not originally emphasize a congregational worship, there is abundant proof that even as early as the time of Asoka, there were gatherings of the faithful for purposes of veneration. The concept of integrity leading to illumination and finally emancipation from the limitations and sorrows of mortal existence also found an immediate response from man's inner convictions. Neither Taoism nor Confucianism effectively filled this place in man's moral consciousness. Thus, Buddhism complemented the marvelous speculations of the Taoist metaphysics and the austere formalities of the Confucian code of deportment. The three schools survived together because they met the three divisions of human aspirations. The spread of Buddhism was due in part to the distribution of the sacred relics of the Buddhas and the Arhat Bodhisattvas. When the question arose as to what should be done with his remains after he had attained the parinirvana, Buddha is reported to have left singular instructions. He advised his disciples to forget the subject entirely. It was their concern to preach the doctrine and not to become keepers of mortal remains. The Master further explained that those incapable by their own attainments of teaching or disseminating the philosophy would find consolation in preserving the relics. This is precisely what occurred. Devout laymen cherished the priceless objects and constructed for them rare and beautiful reliquaries. It was in this way, for example, that the Shui Dagon in Rangoon, Burma, gained the treasures which were buried beneath it. By a similar circumstance, a tooth of the Buddha was carried to Ceylon, and there enshrined within 11 containers of priceless workmanship. Although direct evidence is lacking, there is every reason to assume that the Borobudur in central Java and the great rums of Cambodia were also monuments associated with the holy relics. The spread of Buddhism beyond the boundaries of India was also accelerated by the beautiful religious symbolism through which the original code was unfolded. Eastern peoples are much given to allegory and fable, and the flowering of Buddhist legendary appealed to the deep emotional instinct in human nature. Buddhism has been criticized for the extravagance of its lore, but this was largely the result of the gratitude of worshippers who found countless ways to embellish the original narratives. The Western critic is wrong, however, when he assumes that there is no simple human story of the Buddha. It only occurred that the seed, falling into a rich and ready soil, grew luxuriantly, nourished by poetry and fancy. Everywhere those who received the doctrine felt a profound personal gratitude, As one writer with entirely non-Buddhist persuasions grudgingly acknowledges, I admit that Buddhism conferred many other benefits on the millions inhabiting the most populous parts of Asia. It introduced education and culture. It encouraged literature and art. It promoted physical, moral, and intellectual progress up to a certain point. It proclaimed peace, goodwill, and brotherhood among men. It depreciated war between nation and nation. It avowed sympathy with social liberty and freedom. It gave back much independence to women. It preached purity in thought, word, and deed. It taught self-denial without self-torture. It inculcated generosity, charity, tolerance, love, self-sacrifice, and benevolence, even toward the inferior animals. It advocated respect for life and compassion toward all creatures. It forbade avarice and the hoarding of money. And from its declaration, if a man's future depended upon his present acts and conditions, it did good service for a time in preventing stagnation, stimulating exertion, promoting good works of all kind, and elevating the character of humanity. No other explanation than the above is necessary to an understanding of the forces which caused Buddhism to have a broad and deep appeal. It revealed in tangible form a proper and suitable code, and most of all, it encouraged personal integrity. The very honesty of the over-concept was so evident and so undeniable that the doctrine was eagerly embraced by those of good principles and constructive intent. Especially it appealed to such underprivileged classes as had slight consolation from other faiths of the day. Inevitably, virtue was interpreted according to local standards, and the original teachings were considerably modified. Even so, the broad program was ethically satisfactorily, except to those of tyrannical inclinations. Even the original Sangha, however, was aware that the teachings of the Buddha would fall upon evil times. There are early intimations and admonitions relating to this phase of the doctrine. When Buddha relinquished his bodhisattvaship in the Tushita heaven, he transferred this power to the Maitreya, who was to succeed him in the great line of instructors. It was then prophesied that after 5,000 years, the revelation brought by Gautama would be so diluted by worldliness, obscured by error, and perverted by selfishness that its purposes would be frustrated. When this day came, the Maitreya would come into birth as a human Buddha and appear as the fifth of the great enlightened ones. He would carry the symbol of eternal mendicancy, Gautama's begging bowl, which before that time would be transferred to the Tushita heaven and be bestowed upon him. In this day to come, the Arhat Bodhisattvas, dedicated to the service of truth, will again surround the incarnated Buddha, and a new revelation of the law will be given. It is not stated that the Maitreya will merely confirm his predecessor. The teaching will be suitable to the times. Appearances change, but the substance is ever the same. Maitreya will not fight against the forces of darkness, but will simply reveal the light, which by that time men will desire because of the disasters which must forever accompany ignorance. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.